What you're going to hear here is a program that we recorded live on April 9th at Watkinson School as part of a series called Freshly Squeezed. The topic was, how do we get back to the field of dreams? The notion being that sports have lost some of their innocence. Let me tell you about the panel. It includes Jeff Jacobs, a columnist for the Hartford Courant, Rebecca Stearns, the Vice President of Operations and Director of Education at the Corey Stringer Institute, Reggie Hatchett, who runs both the Connecticut Basketball Club and stepped in this year as coach of Weaver High School's varsity basketball team and led them to a conference title and then to the Class M championship game, and Glenn Cusano, who's coached for about a decade in youth sports and whose daughter suffered a concussion while playing youth sports. I began the conversation with a reference to the TV series Friday Night Tykes, which is a documentary-style TV show about 8- and 9-year-old football players in Texas. It's created a lot of controversy. The Corey Stringer Institute, which is concerned with sports injuries, has come out against it on their website. So I asked Rebecca Stearns, what's the problem with Friday Night Tykes?
Well, our main concern with the show when we first saw it was just the lack of health and safety precautions implemented within the show. So there were many discrepancies in the show in terms of the policies and procedures that we are implementing and suggesting that these youth sports safeties programs implement. And the show basically showed this entire group of youth football coaches and athletes going in the entire different direction. So very, very intense practices, sort of a practice regimen that would not allow athletes to basically recover and protect them from the many different conditions and health and safety issues that could arise given those conditions.
I think you're not being sufficiently unfair to Friday Night Tykes. This isn't a show. Anybody seen this show?
Yeah, I've seen it.
Yeah, you've seen it, yeah. So you know what it's like. This is a show where the coaches routinely tell the players that they should try to make the other team cry.
Yep.
They have encouraged their players to hit with their helmets and to make head-to-head contact with other players. Talking to 8 and 9-year-olds, they talk about basically blood. They talk about, if you cut these guys, they're going to bleed just the way that we bleed. I mean, some of the rhetoric that goes on among these. So it's a little bit more, I would say, really, than that, they're not attentive enough to hydration, which I'm sure they're not.
No, they would be considered encouraging the actions that we are trying to completely avoid by just regular play, potential head injuries, heat illnesses, and catastrophic neck injuries, and all of those where if you don't have proper techniques and you're encouraging hitting head-to-head, then yes, we are going to see much more instances of catastrophic injury.
Now, 2 of the coaches who are on this program have now been suspended, but one senses that they've been suspended because the program's on television, not because this wouldn't not ordinarily go on. You're nodding, yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's pretty obvious what's going on there. I think a lot of it is for show, but that kind of thing actually does happen. I've never coached a football team. I've coached mostly softball and baseball. And if you can believe it, that kind of coach does exist in softball and baseball.
But one thing that's happened that I think happens again and again, Jeff, and I think you've seen this. Okay, so this show was actually conceived of by and is produced by a guy who before this did an MTV show called Two-A-Days, which was also about a very tough high school football program. Now he's dropped down to 8 and 9-year-olds. But that show also showed a lot of things that we might consider to be abusive coaching techniques, and the coach got in a lot of trouble. But the other thing that happened was, in both of these cases, parents immediately rallied around the coach. Even these guys who are having 8 and 9-year-olds do head-to-head contact and stuff, when they get in trouble, when they get suspended, the parents are going, no, these coaches have our kids' best interests at heart. Maybe it doesn't look that way, or maybe they break a few rules to do it. And you must see a certain amount of that. Just kind of, we're all kind of enabling certain things.
Oh, yeah, until their kid doesn't get to play enough. Then they're down the coach. Let me just say this. I'm against youth football at that age anyway. I did not let my boy play that. I just think it's a really, really sick and perverse kind of game we play with American youth. And fortunately, there are fewer and fewer kids playing football at that age now. And I would encourage that. I'm not even sure I believe in football at all. If they told me that the NFL was banned tomorrow, I'd sleep easily.
One of the problems with this show is what we're seeing is that standards, if they work even for older players, for college players or adults, are being applied to 8 and 9-year-old kids.
Correct.
They're being held to the same level of play and accountability that might maybe make sense for a high school kid, a college player, a pro player. And I'm assuming in the sports that you coach, you see some of that too. The standards for older players are dropping down to these younger players.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's kind of a copycat thing. The coaches and the parents really see what's going on at the higher levels, at the older ages, and they want that for their kids because someday they want their kid to be that kid. Mm-hmm. And they feel the only way to get that is to copy what's going on. And the same things that are happening in 12th grade or maybe even in college are not the things that should be happening in 3rd grade and in junior high school.
So give an example. How does that play out?
I'll give you a coaching example because I've coached with a lot of different people. Some of them have been very, very good, and a few, thankfully only a few, have not been so good. And I can tell you that there are coaches out there that do exactly what we've talked about on Friday Night Tykes, and they push so hard that, for example, I had a girl who was playing on a travel softball team, and I don't know if anybody knows about travel teams. It's where you pay a huge sum of money to have your child basically travel around the country to go play, in different towns and cities. They are sort of the special teams of youth sports. She was playing both. She was playing on my town team, Granby Little League, which is where I coach, and she was playing on this very expensive, very aggressive travel team. Again, it's not football, it's softball. But this girl would come to my practices covered with bruises, bleeding, scraped up, and usually in tears because of what took place at her travel softball team practice. Now, she's a good friend of my daughter's. I was the manager of that team, and I got to the point where I almost felt like it was child abuse, what this guy was doing to this girl. She was the one girl that year that played travel softball team that played on Granby Little League, and that she was the last girl because the next year this coach told all his players, if you want to play on my travel team, you cannot play town ball. I don't want you coached by anybody else.
Reggie, you and I were talking the other day, and I used the word fun, playing for fun. And you said that's becoming extinct at certain levels, the whole idea of playing for fun. Explain what you mean. Tell us more about that. Explain what you mean.
Okay, well, I think that the nature of youth sports today, there's so many high expectations that parents have, not just coaches, parents have of where they want their child to be. Unrealistic, I want my child to be LeBron James. I want my child to be Chris Paul. I want my child to be all these different type of people. So I need for you to do whatever it is that you need to do to get them there, even if it's against the child's will. And I also think that, when you go to high school sports, like say, for example, in Connecticut, you have the CIAC, which has all kinds of regulations for high school sports for coaches. But in most AAU circles or travel or whatever, the only, regulations is do you have the time to do it? If you have enough time to do it, then, hey, you're our coach. It doesn't matter if you, have anger issues or so with those, parameters being set, you don't really have the kid who just plays casually anymore because that kid cannot exist on some of these teams because everybody there is obsessive to the point where if you're not coming to extra practices, if you're not willing to do the things that's going to get you hurt, then you can't compete anymore. So I really believe that the way that youth sports is moving, the kid who actually just plays for fun is becoming extinct.
Mm-hmm. And what age does that start? I mean, at what age are the demands the way that you just described them?
True story. I just went to an AAU tournament last weekend. I was watching a group of 9 and under basketball, and you would have thought it was the NBA Finals. How the parents were acting, you suck, coach. Put my son back in the game, and they yelling to their son, "You let that kid score again, I'm gonna punch you." To their own kid, that kind of a thing. And it's really, so I know in basketball, it really starts 8, 9 years old.
If I can interject there. First of all, I wanted to point out, go back to how parents get involved. If people watched the Kentucky-UConn game the other night for the national championship, I was covering that, and the Harrison twins are big stars on Kentucky. Their father was sitting maybe from here to the second row from me, yelling at his kids, coaching them. This is a national championship game. And you're talking about, it starts at 8, 9-year-old. Even at the top level, no one ever told him to sit down. Sir, will you sit down and shut up? My own son, he plays high school basketball and he plays AAU. And it's very difficult for he and his friends to, if they're good at one sport, to even swallow just being the bench guy on another sport. The focus is on, I got to be the best of that. If I'm good at one thing, I'm just going to play all year on that one sport. It's crazy out there. I can't even watch. My son, in last weekend alone, he suffered a broken nose and a broken thumb in the AAU. Instead of teaching him good sportsmanship, you know what I'm worried about this summer? Get him to hit the weight so he's not so skinny. I'm a person that's pushing these wrong ethics as much as anybody.
Well, allow me to interject here and play, I don't want to say the devil's advocate, but just to offer the other side of this, because there is another side. I don't necessarily agree with it, but there's, like, you have to look at Connecticut sports is behind the rest of the country, far behind. UConn won a national championship last night. They only have one kid on their team from Connecticut, and he didn't get in the game. There are only 2 kids last year, or this year coming up, that in basketball that are receiving Division I scholarships in the entire state. And one of them is an import from Africa. So when you look at Connecticut, we are definitely behind other states. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that we have so many rules and regulations that really baby our kids. I was a youth coach, and I know a lot of the youth leagues, they'll say, if you're up 10, your team has to stay inside the three-point line. You can't play defense, can't block a shot, don't try to get a steal. You got to let the other team shoot. They don't do these kind of things in Philadelphia, in New York City. And that's the reason, I believe that's the reason why you see so many, like, superstar athletes coming from larger market areas as opposed to coming from Connecticut. And another thing is, I went to school in Delaware, which is really close to D.C., really close to Philly. And high school kids have places there that stay open till 1, 2 o'clock in the morning, like run and shoot basketball, where you can just, at 1 a.m., you can go, like, shoot around if you have the desire to. Those things don't really exist in this area. So the kid who wants to put in that extra work to become a great shooter can actually have outlets to go do those things, and I don't think those type of places exist in Connecticut.
Well, we'll come back to that. You know, another part of this, while we're sort of on the issue of starting young, is the level at which, or the age at which kids are now identified as future prospects. I'm going to share with you an article from the New York Times a couple months ago. Before Haley Berg was done with middle school, she had the numbers for 16 college soccer coaches programmed into the iPhone she protected with a Justin Bieber case. She was all of 14, but Hales, as her friends call her, was already weighing offers to attend the University of Colorado, Texas A&M, and the University of Texas free of charge. Haley is not a once-in-a-generation talent like LeBron James. She just happens to be a very good soccer player. And that is now valuable enough to set off a frenzy among college coaches, even when, or especially when, the athlete in question has not attended a day of high school. For Haley, the process ended last summer, a few weeks before 9th grade began, when she called the coach at Texas to accept her offer of a scholarship 4 years later. Now, Jeff, but you've seen this happen, right? This is
Ryan Boatwright was offered in 8th grade. It's unbelievable. One of the worst poxes upon the sporting nation is these recruiting sites in basketball, football. They're assigned stars, and it starts at an unbelievably young age. It skews how we look at young people. We're so into lists and rankings, and we start quantifying these kids at such a young age. Talk about sports building character. I'm a big believer in sports reveals character, and I say that because so much of the character is from the parents and from the time they come out of the womb. And we put so much pressure on the coaches, like, to somehow teach kids ethics and things like that. You work on your kids to be a certain way, and then they're bombarded about how important they are by what their ranking is on some guy who's running some site out of his mother's basement. He's 33 years old, making a living ranking your kid and my kid. It's sick.
One of the things that's going to be kind of a struggle is to get Jeff to express his opinions on things. But as he loosens up as the evening goes on, I think that'll be possible. Well, you know, Rebecca, at KSI, I guess the other part of this is you're looking at injuries. And I'm assuming that as all of this pressure drops down the age scale to kids, first of all, whose bodies are still growing, whose bodies are still forming, are you starting to see a different kind of injury as a result of that?
Oh, well, we're seeing a huge increase in youth injuries, and the more concerning thing is that we're seeing increases in sort of the catastrophic area of those injuries. So if we look at the last 35 years, And we usually break it up into 5-year blocks, but the last 5-year block had the most number of most number of heat stroke deaths than any other 5-year block in the last 35 years. We have all this information and, we're getting smarter, but it's not being applied. And we're seeing these huge increases, and the numbers that we had for the last block were actually twice any other average for a 5-year block. So we're about to close in on the next block, and we're seeing about the same numbers. So the good news is that it didn't increase, but the sad news is that it's still much higher, especially for a condition that we know we can treat and prevent and keep people from dying from, which I believe can be applied to pretty much all of these catastrophic injuries that we do have out there.
So, Reggie, I want you to imagine a prospect, one of the prospects that you've handled, or we can make up a prospect. So his name is Travion Taylor, and he's 13, 14 years old, and he's good enough so that some of the freaky guys that Jeff's talking about down in the basement are starting to read him on sites and stuff like that. And
I have a list of those guys' numbers.
and you want to protect you want to protect this kid. You want things to turn out for him right. So who are you worried about? Who in this particular jungle are the predators?
The AAU coaches is like the Wild Wild West. I mean, it's to the point now where if you have a son or daughter who is a projected, like a superstar, you have to walk them to the bathroom at an AAU tournament. You cannot allow them to go anywhere by themselves because they'll be attacked by this person trying to give them a card, that person trying to give them a card. One of the greatest men I've ever encountered in this whole area is Kevin Ollie. I believe Kevin Ollie is a stand-up guy, strong morals, like really, really just a good guy. And I'm really happy that things are happening for him. But even Kevin Ollie he may not want to get involved in the dirt, but in order to survive, he has to. I personally know a guy that I used to coach named Jermaine Samuels. He's now a 9th grader. Kevin Ollie offered him a scholarship last year as an 8th grader because this guy is obviously going to be a Division I basketball player. His father's 6'9". When Kevin saw him, he has no choice but to say, you know what, I need to get involved with this guy. Now, he may think he's way too young, but I know if I don't give him my card, Calipari will when he sees him, or Patino will when he sees him, then I'm going to be behind the 8 ball because I wasn't the first one to offer him something. So I don't want to be behind those guys. When you see a guy like Kevin Ollie who's trying to do things the right way and who was able to win a national championship, and I'll say this, with minimal talent, UConn was not the most talented. The better team didn't win the championship. Kentucky was loaded with talent, but Kevin Ollie, to me, was the better coach. So imagine what he would do with some of the talent that Kentucky had, because Kevin Ollie has not had access to any of those kind of guys. He hasn't had a McDonald's All-American at UConn. Imagine how good UConn would have been had Andre Drummond stayed.
When you say that with our 13-year-old or 14-year-old imaginary basketball player, or maybe even younger, that if he's at a tournament or something like that, you better walk him to the bathroom. You're not kidding, right? That's not
that's real.
Yeah. And so if you don't, or if you just leave him standing there, coaches will come up to him, and then what will happen? What's wrong with that, or what's going to happen that's not good?
The bad example is when you have a young man who obviously is a great basketball player but lacks morals, or he just doesn't have the right attitude to be, on that level. And you want to discipline him. So you say something like, if you do that again, you're not playing. Okay, so now you got to prove to him that you're going to stick by your word. Now you sit this young man out. There's 7 coaches that's going to approach him and say, I wouldn't do that. Why is he treating you that way? And next thing you know, you're at the next tournament, and he now has on a red jersey. He's playing for that coach that approached him while you were trying to discipline him. Yeah. So he never got the lesson, and you lost your A1 stud. So now you can't even compete with the red team because they took your guy when you was trying to teach him a life lesson. Mm-hmm. So you're almost like stuck between, do I try to discipline him and lose him to a guy who doesn't care about disciplining him? Because a lot of the youth coaches, that's the last thing on their list. They just want to win at any cost. They're not trying to teach the young man a life lesson. Mm-hmm. So,
Glenn, at the coaching that you do, are you seeing these kids at young ages who are already getting defined as prospects?
Absolutely. Mostly the pitchers. Mm-hmm. And we all know what's happening to our young boys and girls who are pitching extensively. Pitch counts are being ignored. Kids are having to have surgery, at 13 years old. because their coaches insist and their parents insist that they throw curveballs at 13. I mean, I don't know a 13-year-old kid that needs to throw a curveball. This is kind of like where we're going off of the tracks here. We see what's in the media. We see our pro sports people. There are icons, our heroes, there are children's heroes, and there's good ones and bad ones. And there's a whole list of bad examples, and a lot of them are on the New York Yankees, unfortunately. But monsters aren't born, monsters are made. And, I hate to say it, coaches and parents are making them. And the system is making them. It's like a mill. You put your kid into this mill and you turn the crank, and you're hoping against hope that in 10 years, 5 years, 3 years, whenever they get to college, that they're going to go on scholarship, they're going to play at a D1. I mean, there's all these dreams that we're putting into their heads. And, Reggie hit it right on the head. They can't handle it. And so if they do get to if they do get to college, if they do play in college and go on to pro sports even, they may be great athletes. They're not good people.
Right.
On the other hand, I don't even know who I'm asking this of, but somebody will jump in and say this. I mean, it kind of was contained in something Reggie said earlier. On the other hand, I think parents look and they think, well, if Richard Williams wasn't the guy that he was,
right,
Venus and Serena would just be, people who coached tennis at the high school level or something like that. If some of the stories that we read about, whether it's in baseball or tennis or basketball, are stories of people who were handled, young kids who were handled and developed. I mean, LeBron James was identified at this incredibly early age. And so the parents say to themselves, well, then we're doing a disservice to our kids if we don't do that for them.
That was a nice commentary.
Yeah, well, it's not what I necessarily...
You want my real opinion? Yes. Some of what we're talking about here is there's a lot of people that are really on the edge. We can go on through history, Mozart on down, that are borderline crackpots. And Richard Williams is a borderline crackpot. At one level, he is a wonderful father, and at another level, he's a borderline crackpot. You're almost like a critic at a basketball game, and you're critical saying, oh, that kid's not tough enough, or that kid's not this or that. Yet as a parent, I'm here fretting that some of you people on the panel here might push my kid too far. So it's somewhere that I'm not quite sure. I know I don't have the answer to, but I know I have felt both of those emotions. Like, hey, kid, get up. And the other one's like, oh, don't push my kid so hard. And that's where it's kind of hard to define exactly what you want to happen.
Rebecca, I'm guessing that Corey Stringer Institute lives in that area to a certain degree. I mean, some of the time, as you approach sports programs about the kinds of concerns that you have, sports programs don't want to be famous for their x-rays, right? It's not as though they're completely immune to the suggestions that you guys make or the information that you want to provide. On the other hand, it's exactly as Jeff says. They also don't want to be the programs that didn't pursue excellence furiously and ferociously enough to get where they want to go. So what's your experience as you approach programs with your message?
When we're trying to bring in these policies and these health and safety initiatives, we mix in with them all of the performance benefits that coincidentally also come when you're playing smart and you're playing healthy. So if you don't have the injuries and you don't have to take athletes out, they're going to get fitter, they're going to get better, they're going to get smarter, and you're not going to have all the injuries. So we really do marry both the performance and the health and safety, and they really do coincide with each other. So, we found that you can take simple measures, very simple steps and guidelines and policies that cost no money, and you can drastically reduce the injuries and also catastrophic injuries that occur. So a simple example is in the last 3 years, we've had 13 states come on board with heat acclimatization policies for the high school football level. This was something that the NCAA did back in 2003. They started implementing these heat acclimatization policies because they were having 1 to 2 deaths every football preseason. So they did this in 2003, and in the last 10 years, they've had 1 death. So that policy change alone saved 15 to 20 lives. And so now we're seeing that implemented at the high school level, and 13 states have already passed those. And in those 13 states that have passed those, they haven't had any deaths from heat stroke in those states.
You're listening to a conversation called How Do We Get Back to the Field of Dreams? It was recorded at Watkinson School on Wednesday, April 9th as part of the Freshly Squeezed series. We'll come back with more of that conversation after this. Welcome back to our conversation, How Do We Get Back to the Field of Dreams? Part of a Freshly Squeezed series at Watkinson School. You're listening to a panel consisting of Jeff Jacobs, Reggie Hatchett, Rebecca Stearns, and Glenn Cusano. Let's hear a little bit more of that conversation. Jeff, I want to come back to something you were saying before, because I do think we are at a kind of watershed moment, at least as far as football goes, that there's a new conversation that seems to be going on. I feel this myself. All right, I'm this completely twisted Packers fan. I could tell you every offseason move that the Packers have made and every free agent that they're looking at. On the other hand, this year I watched their incredibly talented tight end, Jermichael Finley, get tackled really hard twice, leave the game once, come back, get tackled again with an obvious concussion. And I was sitting there looking at the screen and I was saying, don't come back. Go to the hospital, get checked out, and then don't ever play football again. Which usually if you in the past, if you're a fan, you just hope the guy can come back. I was looking at him thinking, go home, be with your kids. You've already got some money. You've got a life. Don't do this anymore. And I do feel as though watching even the PBS Frontline Special League of Denial, the thing that the Fainaroos did, and realizing that the NFL really did repress medical evidence about the dangers of concussions and discourage researchers about this, I'm struggling. I mean, I've had this kind of Brokeback Mountain relationship with the NFL. I can't quit them. But I kind of want to.
Right. No, all right. The NFL is unbelievable entertainment. You have violence, you have gambling. I covered hockey for a long time before I became the columnist for 20-odd years. So it's sort of the first half of my career was all involved in that and had a lot of the same problems. And I'll admit, 1979, 1980, things like that, I was one of those guys that's get up and tough it out. I've come so far on that I've become absolutely frightened by seeing those NFL players that are 55, 60 years old. God, they're borderline vegetables, and that's not hyperbole. That's collision. It's not like brutality. It's not WWE. It's just even tackling correctly, and that will eliminate a lot.
Did you want to say something?
Yeah, I was going to say that. One of the things, I heard somebody say earlier, I'm not sure who it was, about youth coaches and the influence that we have. A lot of times people use that influence for their own negative agenda or anything or things like that. But I do use my influence to discourage the guys that I coach from playing football. I just don't believe that, playing football is going to be helpful for them because of the high risk of injury. So that's one of the biases that I do have. He said earlier jokingly, but I do believe that, football should be somebody should take a very serious look about doing away with high school football altogether.
But, obviously football is not the only place, Glenn, that you can get hurt.
That's right.
So we all grew up, we all grew up. They're younger, I think, than we are. We all grew up with the word concussion meant something different to us, I think. I went to a sort of rival private school to Watkinson, and concussion meant, that you went over to the sidelines, the coach asked you what day it was, and if you got it or were maybe within one day or so. I mean, that was about it, really, and maybe somebody'd have you follow a finger or something like that, but not necessarily.
It was a shake it off.
Yeah, and the word TBI, the abbreviation TBI, didn't exist.
No.
So there wasn't, a concussion was something that you just sort of got over as fast as you could and got back in. As a coach and as a father, you're sort of learning a different story about this, right?
Well, it was all brought home to me a few years ago when my daughter actually played on a travel basketball team, which was a very aggressive league, a very aggressive team, and playing against teams that, frankly, were much, much bigger girls. So what happened was there was a loose ball in the backcourt. Two girls went after it. One of them was Sarah. They slammed heads, and bad enough if you're wearing a football helmet, but at speed, my daughter fell. So there's one blow. My daughter fell back, hit her head on the floor. There's a second blow. So actually a double kind of whammy. Long story short, it's been 2 years and 2 months, and there are still a couple of symptoms from that injury. That's a very long time for a child. At the time, she was, I think, 12 years old. And it's continuing to happen. And on that team in that year, there were, I think, 3 or 4 girls that were injured. There was a broken wrist. There was a broken ankle. There was a sprained ankle. There was a girl who caught an elbow in the throat at speed by a girl probably a half a foot taller than she was. There was not one single time, and I guess maybe we can start getting into sort of, the refereeing of these games. There was not one single flagrant call against any of these plays. And the last thing that I want to say about all that is my son will never wear a football helmet and walk out onto a football field ever as long as I'm in charge.
What you said, it really touched me, and I've come to these same conclusions as a sports columnist. However, we look back in the history of sport, some of the most uplifting stories have been athletes that have come from very difficult circumstances, and they've come out of some of the most violent sports, boxing. Willie Pep, arguably the greatest athlete in Connecticut history, is a boxer. It's interesting for you to say that about football because there's still kids in economically challenged areas that are big kids that aren't basketball players, but they're stout and they can be linebackers, and that chance to be really successful in life in these tough sports, it's something that, when they come around, it's uplifting to me to tell that story when they're in the NFL or at major college. But they're battling the injuries, concussions at the same time.
I think the important thing to remember, too, especially when we're talking about youth sports, is recognizing the role of a medical provider. And, of course, the collegiate and professional levels have great access to great medical care, but these youth sports are kind of our least protected athletes. And when you think about it, they're sitting in school all day, and they have a nurse there who can help them with any health issues during the day, and then they go out to sports at the end of the day. And a lot of the times at some schools or even youth events when they're just run by the parent, there's no medical care and they're running at each other. And I think a lot of the issues we're seeing can be resolved if we just have someone there that's knowledgeable, can treat it, and let that athlete really recover the way they're supposed to before putting them back in the game.
Well, speaking of smart, there's a terrific book called Newton's Football that's co-written by Anissa Ramirez, who's was a professor of engineering at Yale. And she actually, because she wasn't as immersed in the world of sports, kind of looked at this stuff a little bit more dispassionately. And so I've got the book with me if anybody wants to look at it after the forum here. But she, at one point, profiles this guy named Bobby Hosea, who developed a different style of tackling, where, in fact, you don't lead with your head and you tackle upwards. You're smiling like you know about this. And it works. It works so well that one of his protégés, Dashawn Golson. Is Dashawn, is that how you say it? The guy from the 49ers? Yeah. That's a guy he coached. He's now like on every highlight reel for the best hits in the NFL. But he hits in a way that's safer for him and it's safer for the guy who's being hit. But that technique isn't really being taught for the most part. There's a guy named Bill Simpson who for years didn't follow football and worked on race cars and especially on the headgear that's worn by racing drivers. A friend of his took him to a football game. He saw a guy being carried out in a stretcher. He started asking questions about helmets. He started looking at helmets and saying, really? That's what you've got on your heads with this? Obviously a race car helmet has to be designed for a greater impact, but we now know we have an impact problem on the NFL. He started looking at composites, the materials that they use as opposed to what would be really safe. He's convinced there's a way to make a much safer, much more expensive, much more time-consuming to make helmet, but it is safer, and there probably is one, just as there's a better way of tackling. Why is it so hard to implement stuff like that?
The tackling question has been around for a while now. In the 70s is when spearing was outlawed in terms of the NFL. So after that was outlawed and they started penalizing against it, we saw huge reductions in terms of neck injuries, and it's a very small portion of all the injuries that we see now because of that one rule change. Head injuries is a whole other topic that I'm sure we could spend a whole other full day on. Mm-hmm. But I think we're coming to the point now where we're understanding head injuries a lot more, and I think the other interesting fact with head injuries is the most unique part of it is that we really don't have any gold standard for monitoring a head injury. So, if you break your leg, we have an x-ray, you can clearly see that it's broken. But for a head injury, there's no gold standard for looking at it and saying, yes, you still have a concussion, or no, you don't.
I want to get off injuries and move on because we've got a lot of ground to cover here, and I want to get to questions from the audience pretty soon, so start thinking about your questions. Reggie, we've seen, obviously, this wonderful period of days for UConn. Right before the Final Four, Shabazz Napier said something that I've never heard a UConn athlete say before, which is that he really, maybe there have been other occasions, but he talked very directly about the issue of compensation. He talked about the fact that sometimes he's actually hungry. He's actually not had enough food. I want to talk about this. I mean, the kids that we're talking about before, if they make it to the college level, a lot of them are arriving in a situation where they don't necessarily have a lot of money being sent from home to them. They are creating an enormous amount of wealth for somebody, which are, as somebody who nurtures this young talent, obviously you're hearing the debate right now about unions, about compensation. What's your take?
Well, with the college athletes, I think that there's no group that's more exploited than they are. And with somebody like, say, a Shabazz Napier, who, once again, is a great kid, comes from a really tough background, and has the loyalty trait, which a lot of good athletes don't have, because he could have left UConn when things got bad. He didn't. So somebody like that who obviously has the school spirit and definitely represents himself, his family, and the university well, where a kid like that can say, I go to bed hungry some nights because I come from a single-parent home. My mom doesn't have money like that to send stuff to me. And then Coach Ali can't buy me anything because that's a violation of NCAA rules. So there's definitely something that's missing there. A lot of people say, well, you can't pay the athletes because that's a very slippery slope. Then once that starts happening, then how much should they be paid, or who should be paid? Should the stars make more than the guys on the bench, and all that other type of stuff? There's a bunch of other questions that would come along with that. But I definitely feel like there should be some sort of compensation for not just college basketball players, but college athletes, where the university makes money off of them.
Jeff, I thought I had a pretty well worked out opinion on this topic, and I was talking this morning to on a different radio show to Kalila Brown, a professor from Quinnipiac, who was talking about Title IX and questions regarding that, because a lot of schools are having trouble making their obligations. If you start coming up with money to pay basketball players and football players, suddenly you've already got athletic budgets that are in a very kind of complicated shell game, right? You diverting money from some of these programs, or at least claiming there's enough money coming in from basketball and football to play for the other programs, but sometimes not able to meet their own obligations for equality, particularly as regards women's sports.
There's a lot of money, and it's mostly through college football primarily, that is raised in collegiate sports. Do we want to spend it on the athletes? Do we want to help level the playing field in American sports for women, for different sports that have been eliminated, men's sports? Or should we ditch the whole system and go like Europe and have like Real Madrids? And what major college sports, why does it even exist? The huge money is being thrown at women's college basketball. And we're having some just obscene coaching contracts out in the Big 12, where other women's coaches aren't getting that money, or other men's coaches, and it's thrown at them with the hope that women's basketball could somehow become big time and generate more money into the machine of college men's basketball. If you start paying athletes, it could cut into women's sports. Absolutely. Colleges are spending as much money as they're making in a lot of cases. There's a game being played on where the money is going to be spent, on no matter how much you bring in.
On the other hand, Rebecca, at KSI, you're looking at injuries that players get. They're not covered by workers' compensation. If you're a college athlete and you sustain an injury that either impairs your ability to turn pro, or maybe you were never going to turn pro, but this is just a lifelong injury that stays with you. I mean, should there be more support for that person than there is right now?
I feel like a lot of the times the athletes don't ever think about long-term, what if I do have a catastrophic injury and I get injured and I can't do this for the rest of my life and I don't go pro? When I talk to athletes and they're always discussing going pro and going the next year and everything else, well, what's your major? What are you getting your education in? Outside of that, and in terms of who's taking care of them after that, it's a really tough question. I don't know that I have the best answer for it.
I didn't hear from you on this. You've got a daughter, and you've got a son who's never going to play football.
That's correct.
So the chances of any of them being paid by colleges are low. So I don't react to what Jeff was saying.
Sitting here thinking about this, and a little snippet of thought that pops into my mind is everybody gets a trophy. That's something that coaches like to joke about. As they get older, that stops. And I'm starting to think that maybe we rethink that, we turn it inside out. A team like UConn, maybe they should get trophies. And by that I mean they should get some kind of a compensation, some kind of an award, a cash award. there might have to be something, and maybe at the risk of making other teams feel bad, this team is going to get trophies.
That's part of a conversation recorded earlier this month at Watkinson School, part of a series. This panel is called How Do We Get Back to the Field of Dreams? A conversation about sports losing its innocence and maybe finding a way to get some of that innocence back. Welcome to the final segment of our conversation at Watkinson School called How Do We Get Back to the Field of Dreams? A conversation about innocence and play in sports. As long as we're talking about money, there's another part of it that we're not talking about, and that is, let's go back down to the younger players, Reggie. There's a real disparity in terms of access to sports. You were talking about how Connecticut's far behind other states. But there are also, just in terms of some of the sports that we're talking about, there's just a huge disparity in terms of who gets to play sports and who doesn't. If you live in an urban setting, you're going to have fewer opportunities for sports. I read one statistic that said 59% of girls who are from single-parent households will not play a team sport. There's a multi-tier system just in terms of, forget about who gets to be on travel teams, who gets to be on AAU. There's a multi-tiered system here about who gets any athletic opportunity at all, right?
Well, there's a lot of financial stuff going on with schools where they're cutting back programs, and it's usually the girls' programs that go first. Like I know at Weaver, at the school that I teach at, we still have a football team, and by the time the end of the season came along, the turkey game, there was only 14 guys in uniform. That's a danger. Like you only have 14 guys available. 11 of them have to be on the field at once. There's only 3 guys, so you got guys that getting injured that have to play because they have to go both ways and things like that. Like there's no way that we should still have a football team. But so we don't have certain girls teams we don't have a girls volleyball team or whatever. But I think that also has to do with the fact that there's not a lot of girls in our area that get a chance to play. So we're talking about the inner city to play volleyball or softball takes resources. So some of these girls just don't have anywhere where they can go play volleyball before they get to high school, so that they're interested in it by the time they get to high school. So I think that's more of a financial thing than anything else, to be honest with you.
And the financial thing, it doesn't confine itself to the cities, Glenn. Travel, you were telling me how much travel teams cost.
Travel teams, at least in softball, where you actually drive for hours and hours and go to every state probably within a 500-mile radius, you're looking at about $2,000 a year for your child just to join the team. Factor in travel costs, factor in food and lodging, and factor in things that are missed. Your kids are going to miss birthday parties, grandma and grandpa days, and if you have more than one child, chances are you're going to bring them on that trip. So now they're missing out on things that they could be enjoying. It's a lot of money, it's a lot of sacrifice, and people that do it will tell you, yeah, but we think it's worth it because we think our son or daughter is going to probably get a sports scholarship.
I'm getting urgent time cues up there, so I think it is time to go to. All right, so. So you've got the floating mic. All right, so that's Kyone Wolf there. I'll take this moment just to thank everybody who sort of helps out with this. Kyone Wolf and Betsy Kaplan are my team. One thing that makes this very easy for us is that Event Resources does such a great job. They do a lot of our work for us, so thanks to Josh up there, too. All right, hands up. Who's got a question? I can't possibly have asked all. There we go. Right.
I wonder if some of these sports, like tackle football and boxing, should actually be played legally.
Did you have something you want to say?
Yeah, I was going to say MMA is what's destroying boxing, but I think the elephant in the room, and I think he touched on it earlier, is America has an obsession with violence. I mean, at any given time, the top shows on TV are CSI, Law and Order, First 48, something that has to do with somebody dying and the things surrounding that. So the violent culture that America has bred is the reason why something like football, like if somebody was to come out and say, listen, I'm the person that's stopping football, they'd be assassinated. You know what I mean? Because you can't take away that, we have that bloodthirsty mentality. We like to see, even though we may complain about it, we tune in to see the guys basically tear.
I'm talking big here, but I'm part of the mythology. I've glorified some of the big hitters in different sports. So on one hand, I'm talking big here, but I'm also part of the problem. And because you want to glorify a guy that really loves this sport and has so much passion that he makes a good, clean hit.
Lastly, before we move on, at the my team just made it to the state championship game, and one of the guys who works down there is a big boxing guy, and he has a couple of friends in the industry. So he comes into the locker room beforehand. Now, granted, my team is majority freshmen and sophomores. He takes out his phone, he puts it on speakerphone, and it's Mike Tyson saying, you guys are doing a great job. I've heard about you, Bob told me. And the kids were excited. Now, Mike Tyson hasn't been good since before they were born. Yeah. But they were still so excited that this is Iron Mike Tyson talking to. And the reason why he's legendary is because the way he used to knock guys' heads off. So, like, their parents, even though that he doesn't belong to their generation, they were excited as if they knew who he was.
Okay, Jenny, you have somebody up there? Let's go to a question up here.
It's essentially what we're talking about here is an arms race. We're talking about a unilateral, well, not unilateral, but everybody is just continually escalating the level at which there's an expectation that you as a child, you as a middle school, you as a high school, you as a college player will be at this level. And the colleges and the AAU teams and the schools are all feeding into that. So if there was going to be anything that we were going to do, it would require a complete, equal end to the Cold War, so to speak, where everybody says, hey, you know what, we're going to unilaterally, everybody's going to disarm all at once. But there's a huge benefit to saying, hey, you know what, I'm not going to be that person that's going to disarm. So how do you get everybody to unilaterally disarm all at once?
Although, I wonder, I think your point and your image is a great one about the arms race. But, Glenn, in a lot of ways, it's not an either-or thing. Everybody makes a decision on a sliding scale or on a continuum. Right. You've made some decisions about what's going to happen with your kids. Right. They're different from what some of the other parents will decide. Other parents will decide, you know what, my kid's a baseball prospect. He has to play baseball pretty much all season long. Maybe we have to move to Florida so that he's never not playing baseball.
I know somebody that did that. They moved their family to Florida so the kid could play year-round baseball.
We didn't have time, or we haven't talked about PEDs tonight, but, some parents, once again, even at the level that you're coaching at, are making decisions about using performance-enhancing drugs. So every parent makes a whole bunch of decisions. And it may not be true that it's an either-or thing, an arms race, in which either everybody hits the brakes or we just keep going.
There's got to be some guidance. And if you spot this going on, as a parent, as a teacher, as a coach, you've got to somehow try to talk people into putting the brakes on. And that's usually going to be the parent.
The other thing, quickly, once again, don't have time to get all the way into it, but there are places that are making really radical decisions. Fremont, Texas, which is in the heart of Friday Night Lights country, they didn't really have enough money to run their schools. Their schools were substandard. The superintendent of schools finally decided that he would simply end sports. And obviously there were some people who were upset. There were people who transferred, obviously, to be in other schools because their kids really wanted or needed sports. But they also reaped some pretty interesting academic benefits and increased parent participation. Jenny, we probably got time for one more question if you got somebody up there.
One thing you didn't touch on, and I listened to this Bob Edwards show, and they talked about the fact that these college students are not only playing sports, but they're not getting an education. So I'm wondering what your panelists' thoughts are on that.
We kind of look at athletes, young athletes, college athletes, and pros as some kind of a commodity that can be brokered back and forth. We lose sight that they're people, and especially children. We've got to get these kids out in the field and just play, not play a game or not buy all kinds of expensive gear and be at a certain place but just go outside and play. Go in the backyard and play. When I was a kid, we played in the street. Just go out and play and have a good time and smile.
That's a great place to end. So I want to thank this incredible panel. Reggie Hatchett, Rebecca Stearns, Glenn Cusano, Jeff Jacobs. Thank you so much for coming out. Thanks to Watkinson. We hope to be back next year, although we're losing our wonderful headmaster. He's leaving us to go to Pasadena. So thank you for keeping this program going for 6 episodes. Thanks. Have a good night.